In the city of Sacramento, California, the neighbors of a boarding house had been complaining for some time about the unbearable stench coming from the backyard of a woman named Dorothea Puente. The smell was so overpowering that even during the sweltering California summers, many residents refused to run their air conditioners because the foul odor would be sucked directly into their homes. Several neighbors confronted the elderly woman, who would smile politely and claim the smell came from plumbing issues or a few rats decomposing under the floorboards of her house. Neighbors often spotted Dorothea spreading lime across the yard or pouring bleach in an attempt to cover up the odor. Inside the boarding house, tenants suffered even more, watching the old woman constantly spraying lemon-scented air freshener in the living room. Yet the stench always returned, seeping into every corner as if the very air were poisoned. What no one could have imagined was that behind her calm smile and gentle demeanor, there wasn't a grandmother battling rodents or faulty pipes, but a woman capable of committing the most horrifying crimes. The smell drifting from her yard was, in reality, the result of years of unimaginable cruelty inflicted on the very people who had once trusted her care. And when some of her tenants suddenly vanished, it would eventually bring the authorities straight to the door of her boarding house and to the terrible secrets buried in her garden. On the morning of November 11th, 1988, investigators arrived at Dorothea Puente's boarding house looking for clues in the disappearance of a man named Alvaro Montoya. He had developmental disabilities, and his social worker had reported him missing. When they knocked on the door, Dorothea greeted them. One of the investigators asked if they could inspect both the inside and outside of the property. She calmly agreed and let them in. The house was decorated with Christmas lights, cluttered with trinkets, but nothing out of the ordinary caught their eye. Once outside, however, the investigators noticed the soil in the yard looked as though it had been disturbed recently. Some of the officers returned to their patrol car to grab shovels and pickaxes. Not long after they began digging, the tip of a shovel unearthed scraps of fabric and what looked like rotting flesh. As they dug deeper, they struck something that at first glance resembled a tree root, but when they tugged at it, they quickly realized it was, in fact, a human bone. The discovery caused immediate shock among the investigators and drew Dorothea's attention. She came outside to see what they had uncovered. Witnesses recalled her putting her hands to her face, pretending to be shocked. To them, it looked more like a theatrical performance than a genuine reaction. The digging continued, and soon they uncovered part of a foot still inside a shoe. At that point, it was undeniable. The remains were human. The authorities decided to pause the search until the following day and placed the house under surveillance. At that moment, Dorothea was not yet considered the prime suspect, so she was allowed to remain inside her home under watch. The next morning, a team of forensic anthropologists, medical examiners, and county investigators arrived with heavy machinery. Since part of the excavation had already been started, it didn't take long for them to uncover the rest of the body. The remains appeared to belong to an elderly woman, as strands of white hair were still clinging to the decomposed skull. As the digging progressed, reporters from the Los Angeles Times and other newspapers crowded around the property. The scene was already drawing public attention, but when the first freshly buried body was pulled from the earth, the atmosphere became even darker. At the time, Dorothea Puente was 59 years old. She was still inside the boarding house while the bodies were being uncovered, and although she was becoming the center of suspicion, investigators still had no concrete evidence directly linking her to the corpses. On the second day of excavation, Dorothea asked investigators for permission to step out to the nearby Clarion Hotel for a cup of coffee. She wore a striking cherry-red coat, purple shoes, and carried a pink umbrella. The lead investigator allowed her to go, not realizing the mistake he had just made. Instead of entering the hotel, Dorothea walked to the taxi stand and left for another part of the city. Later, it was discovered that she went to a bar she frequented, where she ordered 4 vodka and orange juice cocktails. She then took another taxi to Stockton and boarded a bus bound for Los Angeles. Carrying $3,000 in cash, she appeared intent on starting a new life, ignoring the chaos unfolding at her property. Meanwhile, investigators unearthed 3 more bodies beneath a slab of cement and a 5th beneath a gazebo in the side yard. About 4 hours after Dorothea had left, the officers realized she still hadn't returned. By then, she was already hundreds of miles away, sparking a nationwide manhunt for her capture. As the search for Dorothea escalated, the excavation of the property came to an end. In total, 7 bodies were uncovered, all of them former tenants of her boarding house. The first victim, in chronological order, was Betty Palmer. She had been buried wearing a white nightgown, but her body had been dismembered. Her head, hands, and legs were missing. Puente carefully buried her beneath a statue of Saint Francis of Assisi, just a few feet from the sidewalk in front of the house. Toxicology reports revealed doxylamine, a medication used for allergies and minor pain, along with other prescription drugs in her system. The next victim was James Gallup, age 62. He moved into Dorothea's boarding house in February 1987 after surviving both a heart attack and brain surgery. But he did not survive his stay with Puente. Shortly after his arrival, Dorothea contacted James's doctors, claiming he had relocated to Los Angeles and that she had never heard from him again. His body was eventually found buried beneath a gazebo in the backyard. On October 2nd, 1987, Vera Faye Martin, age 61, was placed under Dorothea's care. Vera maintained regular contact with her daughter until suddenly all communication stopped. Her disappearance raised concerns, but the truth only surfaced the following year when Puente's crimes came to light. Her body was discovered inside a metal shed in the yard. Toxicology reports showed traces of flurazepam, a sedative used for insomnia. Later that month, Dorothy Miller, age 64, became one of Puente's tenants. She was last seen by her social worker, smoking a cigarette on the front porch of the house. After she vanished, Dorothea began forging Dorothy's checks, collecting at least $1,000 in stolen benefits. Dorothy's remains were later found under a concrete slab near a patch of rose bushes in the yard. Toxicology revealed both flurazepam and carbamazepine in her system. The next victim was Benjamin Fink, age 55, a man struggling with alcoholism. He arrived at the boarding house in March 1988. His brother visited him weekly, but by April, Dorothea told the family Benjamin had simply left. They were concerned, but since such disappearances weren't unusual for him, his absence went mostly unnoticed. In June 1988, a large pit was dug near the metal shed in the yard. Benjamin's body was eventually found there, wrapped in a plastic sheet secured with duct tape and covered in blue absorbent pads. The final identified victim was Alvaro Bert Montoya, age 51, who suffered from schizophrenia. He moved into Puente's boarding house in February 1988 and was often seen talking to himself. Just 1 month after his arrival, Dorothea began the process of becoming the official beneficiary of his Social Security payments. When questioned about his disappearance, Dorothea claimed Alvaro had gone to Mexico to visit family. But his social worker immediately grew suspicious and tried, unsuccessfully, to track him down. Soon after, she received a letter wrapped in a paper towel, supposedly signed by Alvaro's brother-in-law. The unusual wrapping appeared to be an attempt to avoid leaving fingerprints, but it only raised more suspicion. The social worker handed the letter to authorities, who then launched a full investigation. That investigation eventually led them to Puente's house, where Alvaro's body was uncovered, buried in a shallow grave in the yard, wrapped in sheets and plastic. Apparently, Dorothea rented out the first floor of her Victorian home mostly to people in need of care, alcoholics, the mentally ill, and those in poor health. When investigators searched her private quarters, they found expensive perfumes and silk chiffon dresses, items clearly beyond what someone of her supposed income could afford. As the investigation continued, more evidence emerged. One handwritten note stood out. It listed the initials of each victim alongside the amount of money Dorothea had taken from them. Authorities estimated she had been receiving at least $5,000 per month from her dead tenants alone. Survivors from the boarding house also gave chilling testimony. Dorothea enforced strict rules inside her home. Tenants paid $350 a month, which included a room and 2 meals a day. But if someone missed a meal, they weren't allowed to eat again until the next scheduled time, meaning they went hungry. She forbade tenants from using the house phone and kept tight control over all incoming mail. Outside the house, Dorothea was methodical in how she chose new victims. Investigators learned she would take long walks to some of the cheapest bars in Sacramento, where she often struck up conversations with lonely elderly men. She would buy them drinks and casually ask about their finances. If she decided they were worth it, she invited them to live at her boarding house. Another former tenant, a retired cook, described Dorothea as almost angelic. According to him, she fed stray cats, gave clothes and cigarettes to tenants, and always appeared willing to help those in need. To the community, she was known as kind-hearted, even respected by older men and local politicians. Despite her image as a benevolent caretaker, Dorothea's past was anything but innocent. And soon, detectives would learn that this was not the first time the seemingly sweet old woman had clashed with the law. According to investigators, Dorothea Puente grew up in Red Bluff, California. Orphaned, Dorothea and her siblings were placed in an orphanage where she later claimed she was sexually abused. By the age of 16, Dorothea, then known among friends as Sherry, was working at a milkshake shop while living in a motel room with another girl. Both of them also worked as prostitutes to survive. That same year, she met Fred McFall, a 22-year-old soldier who had served in World War II. Within a few months, the two married in Reno, Nevada. Between 1946 and 1948, Dorothea and Fred had 2 daughters. Shortly after the birth of the second, Dorothea left for Los Angeles, became pregnant again, and chose to have an abortion. One of her daughters was left with Fred's mother, while the other was put up for adoption. In 1948, Dorothea was arrested for forging a man's checks to buy a hat, purse, stockings, and shoes. She pled guilty and served 4 months in jail. While she was incarcerated, Fred left her. In 1960, Sacramento police arrested her for running a brothel disguised as a bookkeeping service. She was convicted and served 90 days in county jail. Afterward, Dorothea reinvented herself, adopting new names and identities to cover her criminal past. She presented herself as a respectable woman and caregiver, even becoming involved with local charities. By the mid-1970s, she was running boarding houses in Sacramento. In 1978, she was convicted of forging 34 checks she had stolen from her tenants. She was sentenced to 5 years probation and ordered to attend therapy sessions, where a psychiatrist diagnosed her with antisocial personality disorder. But the most disturbing chapter began in 1982. That year, Ruth Monroe, age 61, moved into Puente's home and soon died of an overdose of codeine and Tylenol. While Ruth was reportedly depressed because her husband was terminally ill, her death raised suspicions. Ruth and Dorothea had also gone into business together to open a small cafe. At the time, however, police did not consider Dorothea a suspect. Only a month later, she was arrested for drugging and robbing several elderly men in Sacramento. One victim testified that he had been drugged but was still conscious enough to see Puente rummaging through his home. She was sentenced to 5 years at the California Institution for Women, but served only 3, released in 1985 under the condition that she avoid both elderly people and financial matters. Almost immediately after her release, Dorothea became involved with Everson Gilmouth, a 77-year-old man from Oregon. The two began living together, but Everson soon vanished. His family didn't notice his absence because Dorothea continued sending letters in his name, pretending he was alive. It wasn't until 1986 that the truth came out. Everson's body was found stuffed inside a wooden box, dumped by a riverbank near the Sacramento airport. By then, with multiple bodies uncovered in her yard and her history of fraud, theft, and lies exposed, Dorothea Puente had become the target of a massive manhunt. A few days after her escape, the breakthrough came thanks to Charles Wilgus, a 59-year-old retired carpenter. He was drinking at a tavern called the Monte Carlo in downtown Los Angeles when he noticed an elegantly dressed woman sitting beside him. She introduced herself to Charles as the owner of a ranch in Sacramento, and with a touch of drama, claimed her husband had recently died. At first, Charles thought she was just a lonely widow searching for companionship. But he became suspicious when she began asking questions about his social security benefits. Something felt off. Then he realized why she looked so familiar. She was the woman whose face had been plastered all over the news. Without hesitation, Charles called a local TV station, which immediately alerted the police. Just minutes later, Dorothea Puente was finally arrested. In November 1988, investigators interrogated her intensely, hoping for a confession, but she refused to admit to any of the crimes. On March 31, 1989, Dorothea Puente made her first court appearance at the Sacramento Municipal Court. With a cold expression, she pled not guilty to 9 counts of murder. Her plea guaranteed there would be a trial. It would take nearly 4 years to fully prepare the case. Finally, in February 1993, the trial began. Prosecutors painted Dorothea as a greedy, calculating predator who preyed on vulnerable tenants, people with no family or friends to notice their disappearance, and killed them to steal their government checks. Her defense lawyers downplayed the crimes, arguing that while Dorothea had stolen money, she was no killer. They claimed the stolen benefits barely covered her expenses. But the prosecution dismantled that narrative with dozens of witnesses and hard evidence, including the carpenter she had hired to build the coffin for Everson Gilmouth. On July 10, 1993, at the age of 64, Dorothea Puente was convicted of life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was sent to the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, the largest women's prison in the United States. During her incarceration, Dorothea never admitted guilt. Until the end, she insisted that all the people buried in her backyard had died of natural causes. On March 27, 2011, at the age of 82, Dorothea Puente died in prison of natural causes. Though she was officially convicted of only 3 murders, investigators continue to believe she was responsible for all 9 bodies, 7 of which were found at her boarding house. No matter her tragic childhood or fractured past, nothing could ever justify the deliberate and remorseless murders she committed, turning her boarding house into a private graveyard. 9 vulnerable lives, once trusting in her kindness, stolen by a serial killer hiding behind the mask of a sweet old lady. If this story stayed with you, please consider subscribing, hitting the like button, and letting us know in the comments which forgotten victims or overlooked cases deserve to be told next.